What happens when the king of rock and roll, long gone, reappears in the voice of a new generation? August 16th, 1977. The world stopped. Radios fell silent. Crowds wept in the streets. The king was gone. Elvis Presley, the man who had redefined what it meant to be an artist, a rebel, a voice for the restless, was pronounced dead at just 42. For millions, it was not just the end of a life, it was the death of an era. Rock and roll, it seemed, had lost its anchor. But nearly 2,000 miles away, in a divided Dublin, a teenager named Paul Hewson, soon to be known to the world as Bono, was listening. His city was burning with unrest, torn by violence and shadowed by the Troubles. Yet in the middle of the chaos, a vinyl record spun, and on it Elvis sang. Not just notes, not just melodies, he sang with a fire that broke through the static of despair. For Bono, that voice became more than sound. It was a lifeline, a ghost echoing across oceans, whispering into the ears of a young Irish boy who was searching for something greater than himself. In Presley's growl, Bono heard rebellion. In his gospel-tinged cries, he heard salvation. And in his vulnerability, he heard the terrifying cost of greatness. This isn't just about music. This is about how one man's voice leapt across generations, weaving itself into the DNA of another band. How a teenager from Dublin would grow into one of the greatest frontmen of all time, guided, haunted, and warned by the spirit of the king. Because Elvis Presley didn't just vanish in 1977, his ghost walked on, carried in the songs, the stagecraft, and the raw ache of U2's sound. And for Bono, every time he stepped to the microphone, it was as if Elvis was watching, reminding him of both the glory and the danger that came with holding a crowd in the palm of your hand. But what happens when a young Irish voice begins to echo too closely the fate of America's fallen king? Dublin in the 1970s was not a city of dreams. It was a city under siege. The Troubles had turned the streets into battlegrounds. Bombings, riots, sectarian violence. They weren't stories on the news, they were the soundtrack of daily life. Families lived with fear, young people grew up with anger, and hope felt like a luxury no one could afford. In this fractured world, Paul Hewson, Bono, was searching. Searching for identity, searching for meaning, searching for a voice that could rise above the noise. And in the grooves of an old vinyl, he found it. Elvis Presley's voice cut through the static of division, reaching across the Atlantic like a beacon. Elvis wasn't just America's king. He was a paradox. He carried rebellion in his hips and gospel in his lungs. He could croon tenderness one moment and roar defiance the next. For Bono, this wasn't just entertainment. It was revelation. Here was proof that music could hold contradictions, could embody both the sacred and the profane, could give voice to the restless soul trapped between chaos and faith. In the dim light of his Dublin home, Bono would close his eyes and listen. Elvis sang of love, of longing, of heartbreak, of hope, and though they were American songs, soaked in the heat of Memphis and the soul of the South, they spoke to an Irish boy staring out his window at a divided city. Elvis became the sound of possibility. If he could take the voice of a generation and make the world listen, maybe Bono could too. But the shadow of Elvis was never just golden. He was America's golden boy, adored by millions, yet trapped by the very fame he embodied. Bono felt the weight of that contradiction. He was an outsider in Dublin, mocked for his ambition, underestimated by those around him. But inside, he carried the same restless fire Elvis once had. Bono once reflected that Elvis showed him how a voice could be both a weapon and a prayer. That duality would shape the DNA of U2, songs that wrestled with politics and spirituality, rebellion and redemption. And yet, beneath every anthem there lingered a question: could Bono rise without falling into the same traps that destroyed Elvis? Elvis's story was both inspiration and warning. A boy in Dublin heard the echoes of a man in Memphis, and in those echoes he found his calling. But he also heard the footsteps of a destiny that could devour him if he wasn't careful. Because every note Bono sang carried not just the passion of Elvis Presley, but the shadow of his downfall. And one day that shadow would lead Bono to the king's doorstep, to Graceland itself. By 1987, U2 was no longer a struggling band from Dublin. They were on the edge of conquering the world. The Joshua Tree had catapulted them into superstardom. Their songs, With or Without You, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, weren't just hits. They were hymns echoing through stadiums. U2 had become a mirror for the soul of a restless generation. But success is a strange companion. The brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadows it casts. Bono felt it pressing in. The fame, the temptation, the weight of expectation. He knew this path had destroyed others before him, and one man above all haunted his thoughts. Elvis Presley. So, in the middle of their tour across America, U2 made a detour. Memphis, Graceland, the home of the king. The journey itself felt less like sightseeing and more like a pilgrimage. As their car rolled up to the gates, Bono stared at the music notes welded into the iron, each one a reminder of how a man's genius had been both his liberation and his prison. Fans lined up, cameras flashing, but Bono moved quietly, almost reverently, as if walking into a cathedral. Inside, the house spoke in whispers. The bright rooms, the shag carpets, the frozen-in-time decor. It was both opulent and strangely hollow, like a museum of dreams too big for one man to carry. Bono walked the halls slowly, absorbing every detail. He wasn't looking at furniture or trophies. He was searching for answers. Then came the moment that would stay with him forever, the grave. Standing before the marble stone where Elvis lay, Bono felt the silence weigh heavier than any applause he had ever heard. Here was the final chapter of the man who had once shaken the earth with his voice. Elvis had sung gospel as if calling down heaven itself, and rock as if tearing the gates of hell apart, and yet in the end he was buried like any other man, his story both immortal and unfinished. Bono bowed his head. What was he really seeing? A hero, a warning, or a mirror of what his own fate might be? The Joshua Tree had been U2's exploration of America, its deserts, its dreams, its contradictions. And here at Graceland, Bono saw the living embodiment of that paradox. Elvis was America full of faith and longing, power and fragility, triumph and tragedy. The band left in silence. No jokes, no bravado, just the weight of realization pressing in on them. They were chasing greatness, but greatness had teeth. Elvis had carried the crown, and it had cut him down. For Bono, Graceland was not just a memorial, it was a prophecy. Because as U2 soared higher, the same temptations that consumed the king would come for them too. Fame, excess, adoration. It was all waiting just beyond the stage lights. And Elvis's story seemed to whisper, "This is what happens when the music becomes bigger than the man." When Bono sang, something unmistakable resonated beneath the surface, a voice that wasn't entirely his own. It was raw, unpolished at times, but capable of sudden power that filled stadiums and shook listeners to their core. Critics often called it otherworldly, but to Bono, it felt like a shadow, a ghost threaded through his vocal cords. That ghost belonged to Elvis Presley. Listen closely to Bono in the early years. In the deep growls of Bullet the Blue Sky, in the gospel fire of Pride, in the name of love, in the falsetto cries of With or Without You, you can hear echoes of the king. Not imitation, not mimicry, but a transmission, Elvis's phrasing, his dramatic pauses, his ability to shift from a whisper to a roar, all of it reemerged in Bono's delivery. And it wasn't set just style. It was spirit. In 1993, during the Zoo TV tour, Bono would take the stage dressed in leather, playing a character he called Mephisto, a devilish persona with slick back hair and a sneer. It was camp, it was satire, but it also felt eerily familiar. Elvis, too, had played roles, slipping into the glitz of Vegas costumes and rhinestone-studded masks. Bono was walking the same line, entertainer, prophet, performer, parody. Then came the covers. On tour, U2 slipped Elvis into their set lists. Can't Help Falling in Love wasn't sung as a novelty. It was sung as a confession. Bono's voice trembled with sincerity, as if speaking directly to the ghost of the king. Audiences wept, sensing that something more than nostalgia was happening. It was lineage being acknowledged. But Bono also knew what lived inside that lineage. Elvis's triumph was inseparable from his tragedy. The same voice that moved nations also carried him into a cage of fame, addiction, and loneliness. Bono often spoke of his fear not of failure but of losing himself to the very thing that had given him everything. The stage. He once admitted in interviews that Elvis's story was always on his mind, the danger of believing your own myth, of letting the applause drown out the truth. Bono was determined not to repeat it. But temptation doesn't vanish just because you recognize it. Every tour, every encore, every stadium roaring his name brought him closer to the precipice Elvis had fallen from. And this is where the weight of inheritance became clearest. Bono hadn't just inherited Elvis's sound. He had inherited his burden. The burden of carrying a voice that could shake the world while knowing it could also destroy him. For every gospel crescendo that lifted him closer to heaven, there was a growl that dragged him back toward the shadows. The balance was delicate, the stakes immense. And as U2 reached new heights, Bono began to realize that the only way to keep Elvis's ghost from consuming him was to give that voice a mission beyond himself. Elvis Presley had once fused the sacred and the profane, gospel and rock, heaven and earth. That fusion was his gift and his torment. When U2 carried his influence forward, they didn't just echo his sound, they expanded it, turning concerts into something larger than entertainment. They became a congregation, a rally, a communion of souls. It began with Rattle and Hum in 1988. The album wasn't just a follow-up to the Joshua Tree. It was a declaration. Bono openly wrestled with America's legacy, from gospel choirs in Harlem to the raw blues of B.B. King. And running through it all was the unmistakable presence of Elvis, the man who had first pulled gospel into the mainstream. In the track Heartland, you could almost hear echoes of Presley's yearning in Bono's stage gestures. The sweep of an arm, the sudden hush of a phrase, the king was there in spirit. But U2 went where Elvis never did. While the king mostly stayed silent on politics, Bono thrust himself into the fire. At Live Aid in 1985, he turned a set into a sermon on compassion. During apartheid, he used his voice to demand justice. Later, he would fight for debt relief, AIDS funding, and human rights. Elvis had shown Bono that music could move millions, but Bono believed it could also move mountains. The parallels grew sharper. Elvis had become a symbol of American freedom, even when trapped by its excess. Bono saw U2 as inheritors of that symbolic power, but he refused to let it die on the stage. Where Elvis's revolution had stopped at sound, Bono sought to push it into action. Albums like Achtung Baby and All That You Can't Leave Behind carried this dual inheritance. The swagger, the sensuality, the fire, all drawn from Elvis, but threaded through the lyrics were pleas for forgiveness, hope, and change. Walk On, 1. Where the Streets Have No Name. They weren't just songs. They were anthems of survival, of solidarity, and yet the shadow remained. Bono once admitted that he often thought about Elvis when wrestling with the price of fame. He had everything, Bono reflected, and somehow he had nothing. It was a reminder of the cliff's edge that comes with holding the world's attention. Still, Bono carried on, driven by something more than fear. Elvis had given him the blueprint for stirring the human spirit, but Bono added a new layer, purpose. He wanted the roar of the crowd not just to echo but to act, to feed the hungry, heal the sick, forgive the debt, break the chains. This was the inheritance, not just the fire of Elvis's sound but the chance to redeem its cost. Bono gave the king's ghost a cause, and in doing so he ensured that Presley's influence would not end in tragedy, but live on as a force for change. But legacies are never finished stories. They live and breathe in the voices that carry them forward. And in one Irish anthem the king still sings. Elvis Presley died at 42. The king of rock and roll, the boy from Tupelo who had electrified the world, left his story unfinished. For some, that was the end. For Bono, it was the beginning of a thread he would carry forward. From the narrow streets of a divided Dublin to the vast arenas of the world, Bono walked in Elvis's shadow. He took the king's gospel fire and blended it with Ireland's yearning, turning rock into something transcendent. Elvis had shown him that a voice could shake the earth. Bono showed the world that the same voice could also heal it. Every U2 anthem carries a trace of that inheritance. In the soaring cry of "I still haven't found what I'm looking for," You hear Elvis's gospel ache. In the raw growl of desire, you hear the king's swagger. And in the hushed prayers Bono weaves into his concerts, you hear the ghost of a man who once sang hymns between the walls of a Memphis chapel. But Bono did more than keep Elvis alive in sound. He gave him a stage that stretched further than Graceland ever dreamed. Where Elvis's revolution ended in Las Vegas, Bono's carried into the world's conscience, into the fight against poverty, injustice, and despair. The legacy is not frozen in marble at a gravesite. It moves, it breathes, it changes. True legacies never vanish. They echo, they evolve, they demand to be carried by the next generation. So when Bono stands before a stadium, microphone in hand, and thousands of voices rise with him, it is not just U2 that you hear. It is the king himself, alive in an Irish anthem, reminding the world that music never dies. It only finds new voices. And if in Bono's trembling notes you hear an echo that chills your spine, remember the king's song is not over, it's still being written.